What advice do you have for a young man in his 20s?
It's a pretty non-specific question. Make a plan. Look at what you're interested in. Get disciplined about something. Allow for the possibility that you have something important to contribute to the world, and that the world would be a lesser place without that contribution. Don't be afraid of taking on responsibility. It's where you find what sustains you in your life. You can take on too much responsibility. You have to be cautious in that regard, but that's a less common problem than not taking on enough. A lot of the things that people regard as traps are actually the means to their life. Often young people are afraid of commitment, for example, in the context of a romantic relationship, and because they feel that that's going to interfere with their pursuit of something more valuable. But that's just not the case. You're not going to find something more valuable in your life than a committed relationship with someone that you love, that sustains itself across time, and that in all likelihood produces children. That's life. And there may be people for whom avoiding that is the better route, but those people are very rare, and you need a real reason to assume that you're one of those people. And hopefully for you, you're not. I've had a very good career, a very meaningful career in multiple dimensions, and it's still been the case for me that the most important part of my life has been my intimate relationship with my wife and my family. So don't be afraid of that, or be afraid of it, but don't let that stop you from pursuing it.
What about how much do people have to kind of date around to find somebody, though? Because it does take a bit of exploration to find somebody you're compatible with. So what's a reasonable amount of exploration, and by what age should people have figured it out? Because there's always the grass looks greener. So at some point, maybe you should just settle down. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, life isn't very long. And so you don't get to evaluate that many relationships. You probably only have a 5 to 10 year period to do that, something like that. And then the reason you only have that amount of time is because it gets more and more difficult as you get older rather than easier, partly because people your age are increasingly in relationships. So I would say get at it. Don't overestimate the degree to which you have to find someone versus create the relationship. There's many cultures, and I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily a desirable alternative, but there are many cultures that arrange marriages, and those arranged marriages frequently work. It's not obvious that they work less frequently than relationships or marriages that are predicated on romantic attraction, which has its own pitfalls. No matter who you find, they're going to be full of flaws like you are, and so a lot of it is something you create. I think you want to find someone you can trust and someone that you're attracted to, and perhaps someone who shares the same ambitions as you do, or at least has ambitions that are compatible with yours. And then pretty much all of it after that is what you create rather than what you find.
Is part of the reason that arranged relationships or arranged marriages work, is part of it because there's a societal pressure to not get divorced, and because it's somebody your parents have chosen, there might be an expectation that you're supposed to uphold?
Of course. That's partly why marriages in the West work too, or marriages in cultures where the primary impetus for the marriage is romantic or sexual attraction. Part of the reason those marriages work is because of social pressure. It's very difficult to sustain a relationship across time, and you need all sorts of social institutions as well as conceptual schemes operating to help ensure that that's the case. Because life is so difficult, you're going to go through periods of time where your relationship is extraordinarily difficult, but there's no escaping that. And if the pressure to stay together wasn't there, the relationship might fragment prematurely. And then not only would you have your problems, you'd also not have any relationships. And that's not helpful. So you go through thick and thin together. And it can be very thin. The thin times can be very thin. But the collective judgment of the human race so far has been that long-term monogamous relationships are the best that you can manage. And that's true cross-culturally. There are exceptions. Polygamy is is relatively common, nowhere near as common as monogamy, but there are exceptions made for polygamy. But the problem with polygamous societies is that they tend to be more violent, especially the young men in them tend to be more violent because they are more shut out of the mating game, and that makes them very frustrated.
Oh, that makes sense. So it'd be mostly, yeah, that makes sense. That'd make me pissed off too. Why does this guy over here have 7 wives? He'd be better off dead.
Yes, and I might be the one to help him along with that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of what monogamy does is stabilize societies, and that means that in stable societies, fewer people die. And so, all things considered, our species has decided that that's a good trade-off.
Life's too hard. I tried to do it by myself for a while. It was hard, like I might have needed some time to be by myself, to learn what it was like to be by myself. It's possible. That or I made a terrible mistake, or both.
Well, even when you were by yourself, though, you had friends and you had family. Yeah,
but it is like life's easier if you can find somebody who you're compatible with. You've been like a little bit compatible.
Yes, well, it's also something. There's something to be said about sharing your experiences with someone. They're more real then, and your past and your present and your future are all more real if you have someone who shares them with you.
So advice for a mid-20s man, but that's more advice for just young people in general is a big focus.
Well, the best advice that you can really give to people who are young is that unless you have very good reason not to, you should do what all people have always done. And so what does that mean? When I see my clinical clients, although I'm not practicing anymore, when I saw my clinical clients, I would evaluate their lives across a number of dimensions. Were they immersed in a network of friendships? Did they have a family? And that could be their family of birth, but also the family that they've produced, their own husband or wife and children, if they were of an age where that was appropriate. Did they have a career or at least a job? And was their job productive and matched well with their abilities and their ambitions? Were they educated to the extent that their intelligence and curiosity might demand? Were they in reasonable physical and mental health, independent of those other areas? All of those things need to be established, and you don't want to question them so much that you don't establish them. You might think of yourself as a rebel and someone who's particularly unique, and it's also possible that you are unique in one or more ways. But fundamentally speaking, if you don't do what everyone else does, then the probability that you're abdicating your responsibility and that you will miss out on something important is extremely high. So, our culture, virtually every movie that's made for children now, you see this coming out of the Disney studios constantly, always concentrates on the special child who's got abilities that no other child has and is being crushed by society into being, unpleasantly normal. And there is a fair bit of crushing that goes along with being socialized, because part of being socialized is to become like everyone else. But you don't want to underestimate the benefit of that. It's very, very difficult to tread your own path, and you're only going to be able to do that in a limited number of areas. You blow apart the social routines, you'll find yourself out there in a domain of chaos that will overwhelm you, and that's not pleasant. You do not want that.
You talked about socializing, and I had a few parents reach out, and I haven't actually thought about this, but you talk about how kids have to be socialized by the age of 4 or they're basically screwed. And right now...
That's true, more true with some kids than others. So
okay.
There's a minority of children who are quite aggressive by temperament at the age of 2. And if they're not socialized out of that higher than average level of aggression by the age of 4, there isn't any evidence that that can be rectified later. Now, that may have implications for other elements of socialization as well. It's certainly the case that you want your children to be acceptable to their peers by the time they're 3 and 4, because peers do most of the socialization.
Here's the problem right now, though. Like, I mean, take Toronto, for instance. Everyone's in lockdown. You're not even allowed to go to elementary school right now.
Yeah.
So I had a couple of parents reach out and they're like, we've heard about socializing. Our kid is so, like, they're alone at home. So other than the fact that I personally think lockdowns are ridiculous, what do people do right now if they're missing out on those developmental, like, 2 to 4 years? Like, are there things you could recommend they do? Are there things their parents could do with them, perhaps?
They can play with them and ensure that the children have time to play. And you can be a reasonable replacement for a play partner for your child. Not entirely, but most parents know how to play with their kids, and it's very, very important for children to play. So if your children don't have other children to play with, then you play with them. They need to play.
Okay.
So, and you remember, too, that children are very resilient. So I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that they're going to be permanently damaged by this period of relative deprivation, especially if they have parents who care for them and who are doing what they can to keep them on the proper track, so to speak, during this terrible pandemic.
Plus, everyone's going to be a little stunted after the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And hopefully we're all equally stunted, come out a little dizzy. Like, did you feel behind in your development? Oh, yeah. Well, me too. But we're both 2 years behind. So
Yeah, right.
hopefully.